So part of this might seem a little bit like, Tim's problem with pictures, but I'll move over the problem pieces of it quickly as soon as it comes up there. But I want to offer a context for this, and the context will come up on the wall in a minute. The context is our story as a people and as a country, and where we're going, and where we've been. And so when that gets brighter, you'll see what I call the American promise. I think it'll light up fine. It's just warming up. And that is our DNA as a country. It's not marketplace. We are as good at business as anyone in the world. We are capitalists often. We are driven by all kinds of economic activity. But in our hearts as a country, I think the thing that binds us together as Americans is that, right back to where I'm from, Concord, Massachusetts. We just celebrated at the North Bridge when we stood up to the British on April 19th, 1775. The Declaration of Independence, we're all created equal. We literally started this journey then of doing something humans have almost never done, right? Which is this preposterous idea that equal people are going to govern ourselves together and in pursuit of happiness, right? It sounds like a 1960s commune or something, right? But that was our promise as a country. And of course, all the way along, there have been contradictions, there have been horrible injustices from slavery, everything else. But the thing that has guided us when we're most pressed with challenges like we have today is that dream, which I think we all actually believe in. No matter how hard it is, no matter how far distant it might be, that is what we live for, literally live for. It's what we want to give our kids. It's what we want to feel like we've lived our life. That still goes on. And so as I go through the next few minutes, please just keep that context in mind. This is not a campaign finance problem. It's not a policy problem. It's not even a Supreme Court problem anymore. It's way beyond that. It's a problem of whether we as Americans still have what it takes to, in our generation, carry that a little bit closer to that promise. And I think we do. So that's the good news. I think we do. I know we do. But when we're talking about solutions, those are the kind of solutions we have. There's no easy solution anymore. It's as hard as anything we've done in our country, and we've gone through, every generation goes through horrible, hard stuff to move it a little bit forward. So what the Supreme Court has done in Citizens United is alter this DNA, and that's Representative Jim Leach, who I got that metaphor from. He's retired now, but he was in Congress for 30 years. He's an Iowa Republican. And so when an Iowa Republican is saying that the Supreme Court has genetically altered our DNA towards oligarchic, corporatist kind of government, we are not talking about some, only Thomas Piketty and Bernie Sanders kind of point of view. This is very, very real. That is what the Supreme Court has done. Now, here's the thing, though. It has been a long time coming to Citizens United. I hope it'll be a shorter time coming out of it. But we have been in this kind of situation before. We go through these cycles in the country. And the Supreme Court often, as Tim outlined, sort of lays out the ideology and the law of the time that strikes the country one day as just impossible to live with, that it is so disconnected with not only the American promise, but the real lives of most Americans, that it becomes illegitimate. And it becomes illegitimate when Americans stand up. So what the Supreme Court did in Citizens United is similar to what the Supreme Court did in the Dred Scott case. Cecilia mentioned I started Free Speech for People the day the Citizens United decision was decided. It was actually a little bit before. I'd done a brief in the case, and we prepared for what we knew the court was going to do. And we were ready to go with the 28th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution to overturn that decision that day. And Donna Edwards, an African-American congresswoman from Maryland, introduced the first constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United 2 weeks later. And I only mention she's African American because it was she who said, this is like the Dred Scott case. And the Dred Scott case, you'll remember, was the 1856 decision that the Supreme Court, in its wisdom, said the African American, and I'm quoting now, has no rights that the white man is bound to respect. That was the law of the land in 1856. Not just slavery, but they could not be citizens, that they had no rights in this country. And what she meant by that Citizens United was like that, is that the court had announced out loud in full proclamation, full glory, what the ideology of the time was. Corporations have rights as people. We are not allowed to, literally not allowed to limit the domination of our political system by concentrated wealth. It was as loud and clear a proposition that the problems that most Americans saw were not problems as far as the Supreme Court was concerned. It was the way we govern. And most Americans, of course, say, no, it's not the way we govern. But it was the same moment, I think, a constitutional moment, that when the Supreme Court ruled women have no right to vote. That was a decision of the Supreme Court. The Equal Protection Clause appeared to apply to all persons. After the 14th Amendment was enacted, equal protection of the law applying to all persons, women said, we can no longer be deprived of our right as persons in this country to vote. The Supreme Court said, yes, you can. The 14th Amendment doesn't apply to women. It took some years, but the 19th Amendment overturned that decision. The Supreme Court struck down the first time we tried to tax wealth in the last Gilded Age, the last plutocracy age, almost as severe as the current one at the turn of the 19th century. We tried to enact an income tax. It was struck down by the Supreme Court as a violation of the Constitution. The Supreme Court struck down worker safety laws. Even child labor laws were struck down under a theory of economics that, as Tim says, get pulled into our political sphere. So that economic theory, they called it freedom of contract, but it was another way of saying corporate rights, meant that we literally weren't allowed to have child labor laws, worker safety laws, women couldn't vote, and we weren't allowed to tax wealth. All Supreme Court decisions, all of those overturned by constitutional amendments in the same way we're going to do it now. The Supreme Court said that the poll tax is perfectly fine. Taxing people to vote so that economically, people who didn't have the economic means to pay the taxes, which became cumulative, and especially as it was used to deprive African Americans of voting. Huge issue. The Supreme Court didn't care, said poll taxes are fine, overturned with a constitutional amendment. So this is what we do. That's the good news. Believe it or not, this horrible train of error by the court. 8 times Americans came together to do what's really, really hard and pass a constitutional amendment to overturn the Supreme Court. So this will be Amendment 28. And we are going to do it. And I'll talk a little bit about how we're going to do it and why we're going to do it. But first let me, how we're going to do it and what you can do right now to help if you wish. A few more of the stats, which we know, but I want to just emphasize them because you'll sometimes hear constitutional amendments, we don't need to do that, we just need disclosure, or we need public funding of elections, and there are a lot of good reforms. I'm not minimizing those important reforms, but we have to remember that the constitutional struggle we are actually in, or we won't wage that struggle, we'll wage some other struggle, trying to elect the right person, trying to get the right laws. We need to do those things too, but we have to keep up the constitutional struggle. This is oligarchy. Tim talked about 158 families. Another stat, 400 families provided more than half the money in the presidential election, 0.001% coming up with most of the money. We're now over $30 billion since the Citizens United decision 6 years ago. And we're over $1 billion, just to bring these up to date. So this month we passed $1 billion in the presidential race, and it is now expected to go over $10 billion by the time we're done with this round of federal elections. And I want to say a word or two about Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, neither of which does much for super PACs, both of which I think in different ways are showing Americans ready to do almost anything but back the elites that sold a line about our economic and political organization and the way we should be running our elections that we're not buying anymore. I think that was what happened to Jeb Bush with his meltdown, despite having all the super PAC money. And I think it's part of what is the attraction of a Bernie Sanders or a Donald Trump, is they're saying what it is, which is corruption and oligarchy, and saying they're not part of that. Now, I want to just touch on it because the other thing we'll hear, so we don't have to do a constitutional amendment, that's too hard. See, it's not a big problem because, look, Bernie Sanders raised a ton of money and is doing fine, and Donald Trump is independent of that kind of thing. So here's the problem, of course. If a solution, Ralph Nader wrote a book that was almost satire, but he kind of meant it, I hate to say, said the billionaires will save us. And that's sort of the Donald Trump theory, is that it takes a billionaire to beat the billionaire-dominated economy, dominated political system. I think we can't, if we have to rely on a billionaire to save us, we are beyond saving. So, and on the other hand, the Bernie Sanders phenomenon is interesting. Clearly, again, a hunger to support change and a willing to pay for it, and showing you can run an effective campaign with lots and lots of people giving small amounts of money. 2 million donors giving about 160 million, I think, or so. But here's the thing. He's not winning right now, and only 100 donors have given $190 million to people who aren't named Bernie Sanders. So if 100 donors are wiping out the 2 million donors, and they are, 190 million is effectively neutralizing 150 million, it shows the limitations. We had the same thing in 2012, 32 donors made up, I think Tim might have mentioned this, all the small donors in Romney and Obama's campaign combined, 32 donors. So this is like an oligarchy you would see Russia or anywhere else, where a few families and groups, economic groups, controlled the system. So I won't belabor that, although perhaps we have. But sometimes the other thing you hear is, well, Citizens United said corporations have rights as people, but corporations aren't really spending money in elections, it's the billionaires. And that's sort of true, but we should not lose sight that massive concentration of global corporate capital, again, raising issues not only of plutocracy, but global shareholder structures are incredibly complex, incredibly global. We're no longer talking even about, like, when it was the Rockefeller era, and it was at least American wealth that was controlling our system. We now have global wealth controlling our system. And how they do it, this is just, these logos up here reflect about $700 million in a few years that has come into not only national, federal elections, state and even local elections through front groups that don't disclose their donors. This was ferreted out over time. We didn't know it at the time the elections were happening, but the front groups are the Democratic Governors Association, the Republican Governors Association, and the Chamber of Commerce. I just picked three, there's lots more, and just 700 million in those three alone come in. These are the top donors. A few unions in there, you'll see, to the Democratic Governors Association, corporations to both sides, but massive corporate wealth. A couple of examples, Chevron spent $3 million in a city council election in a community of 100,000 people, where they had a refinery there. They wanted to avoid their responsibility when the refinery exploded in Richmond, California. Yeah, so they, this could be in any community in the country now. So these are the consequences. These aren't just numbers. These are human beings. These are our wages, our land, our water. You know, it's our food. It's everything is impacted by this system that we live in, and it's increasingly, that impact is magnifying. The 14,000 people in Richmond sent to the hospital when the Chevron plant exploded. 29 men died in the West Virginia coal mine explosion, Upper Big Branch mine that Massey ran. At the time that mine exploded, Massey had 63,000 violations of the Mine Safety Act and had been dodging them by according to an independent report by the governor appointed an independent commission. These mine commission reports are often explaining how these deadly accidents happen because of coal dust or, you know, lack of ventilation or whatever. That was part of it. This one, they said, this happened because of our corrupt pay-to-play political system. Massey was immune to regulation. They could violate 63,000 times, and this report said 29 men died because we no longer can control our political system to defend us and most people. And that is striking. So these are, just remember, you know, when we're taking on this fight, if you get tired and the 28th Amendment's a big battle, this isn't just numbers, it's not just campaign money, it is real human beings, it's our families, it's everything. So it is a worthy fight for sure. We got to fight our own apathy, our own checking out, our own sense of despair, frankly. Voting rates are collapsing. We had 13% turnout in a Boston City Council election in November. That's 87% of voters who didn't vote, and it was a contested local race. We are down to around 1 out of 3 eligible voters now vote in midterm elections, presidential races. It bumps up a little bit in the excitement. But most Americans are now either in despair or otherwise neglecting the most fundamental, easiest act of citizen duty. And that's a problem. On the other hand, sometimes despair turns into anger, and we're starting to see that too. And this is normal in societies that are going down the sort of systemic breakdown that this court has taken us. And this isn't a picture of a Donald Trump supporter, and I say that because the quote is actually a Donald Trump supporter. And I like the image. Actually, I think might be Ferguson, but I'm not entirely sure. But the supporter, he's a conservative in Texas who was asked why he's voting for Donald Trump. And he said, conservatism is a failed ideology. Nationalism is the new thing. I just want to sit back and watch the establishment burn. And I'm not saying any of these things to be partisan or pick a candidate or even default that guy. I think some of the phenomena we're seeing is, again, rage and a sense of wanting to see the establishment burn, metaphorically, I hope, or otherwise. So we have apathy, anger, and we've got to come together as Americans to do something different than either of those things, and that is to win the constitutional amendment. So what did I do? I think I escaped. Jay, can you help me out there? So what do we do to take on this fight? Well, let's start with where we are. Okay, so where we are is bad in a lot of ways, but let me tell you some where we are that are very, very good. So actually, before I do that, I didn't mean to say it was very, very good that Justice Scalia passed away. I really didn't. Jay, you put that slide up there. And I don't actually mean that at all. My sentence there is justices matter, but amendments matter more. Because the other thing I think we have to watch is the wish that we all have that someone is going to save us. Right? We're just going to elect the right president. We're going to elect the right person. Oh, now we have a Supreme Court vacancy. These were 5-4 decisions. We just got to get that 5th justice on the court, and we can overturn Citizens United. And I hope that's true, but I caution against that for several reasons. And I caution not against working to do what, of course, we should be able to do, which is have a Supreme Court fully staffed and doing the right thing. I caution against doing that instead of the need to do a lot of work on our own as citizens together. And the reasons are, there's a number of them, but it's not good for the Supreme Court, frankly, to turn it into a political football. It raises the partisan stakes even more, when actually what we should be doing is 80–90% of us already agree, and to turn that agreement that we could be channeling into a 40-40 fight over who's going to win the presidency so they get that Supreme Court appointment, or who's going to get the Supreme Court appointment, isn't the best way to actually get the result we want, but even worse, to actually figure out how we govern together, which is what we have to do. So the other problem with it, though, is, you know, it was 5-4 going the other way for a bit in the 70s, and even into the 90s, and even into the 6 years before the Citizens United case. That similar case had come out the other way before John Roberts and Samuel Alito replaced Rehnquist and Sandra Day O'Connor on the court. It is not good for either the court or our country to flip back and forth on what the fundamental law of the country is, 5-4, 5-4, 5-4. We have to settle this as a people, and we do that with an amendment. So there will be a new Supreme Court justice. I hope that justice makes things better, but we still have work to do as citizens. This is Doris Kearns Goodwin. Like Jim Leach, who I had up there earlier, is an advisory board member of ours at American Promise. And Doris Kearns Goodwin, of course, is the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, presidential historian, author of the Lincoln book, which became the Lincoln movie about the 13th Amendment. Getting won. Bully Pulpit is her latest book. She knows American history. She knows the rhythms of American history. And she is telling us it is time to recognize the historical gravity of our situation. It is time we come together as Americans to win this constitutional amendment. And so what do? I want to emphasize again, when I say we must have the 28th Amendment, I am not slighting other very important reforms. There'll be plenty to do in these years as we are on this pathway together. But I look at it as, transparency, public funding of elections, districting reform, maybe term limits, lobbying and the revolving door, corruption laws. There's a ton of really good policies that we should enact. We should try to win. We should fight for those things. In my view, those are all, like other policies, other laws, blocks of a good, healthy society. But if they don't have a healthy foundation, they're going to crumble, or they're not going to stand up, and they're not going to pass in the first place. The foundation is our constitutional foundation. So political equality is, again, back to the Declaration of Independence. The basic equal rights we have as citizens is not part of our constitutional foundation right now. In campaign finance laws and elsewhere, the Supreme Court says, literally, they say, we are not allowed to rest our election laws on our rights as equal citizens. That would be a losing argument if we tried to make that argument in the Supreme Court. We have to put it back in the Constitution. That's what the 28th Amendment does. That we have fair elections, that they're not a marketplace. That metaphor is misplaced for all the reasons Tim said. We have to put that back in the Constitution. And participation by human beings, citizens in the political sphere. We govern together. And that means corporations, unions, entities that are right and good in the economic sphere don't belong in town meeting. They don't belong in our government of equal citizens. And we have to put that into the Constitution. Those are the principles of the constitutional foundation that the amendment will reflect. Here's one example of language. Sometimes people want to know, well, what will it say? There are 13 or 14 versions of the 28th Amendment now in Congress. Since Donna Edwards introduced that first one some years ago, we're now reached the moment of momentum for this, that more and more politicians want their amendments. So we now have 14 of these versions of the 28th Amendment. But I put this one up because it won 54 votes on the Senate floor in September 2014. A lot of people, it doesn't get reported, this kind of work. And a lot of people don't realize we need 67 votes to win the 28th Amendment in the Senate. We have 54. And it was on this language. So it's basically to advance democratic self-government and political equality for all, and to protect the integrity of government and the electoral process. Congress and the states may regulate and set limits on the raising and spending of money by candidates and others to influence elections. Simple language that I think reflects the consensus view of most Americans. Transformative impact because it puts in our constitutional foundation again, political equality, fair elections, not a marketplace, and the integrity of government. And Section 2 puts the human beings back in our Constitution. That Congress and the states shall have a power to implement this article by appropriate legislation and may distinguish between natural persons and corporations or other artificial entities created by law. Those are the two fundamentals. That's why that one's up there. There are different ones. We'll get the language right, and we'll keep coming back until we win. And there's plenty of room for debate, so we'll keep moving with that amendment. But the point is, it's not some far-off day. We have good language. We have good answers. We have good support for this. And, we have, well, I did it again, Jay. You can help me out. Sorry. We have a plan. and we're winning. Let me share that with you as we wrap up. And so we have a 4-stage plan that to win amendments, here's the 4 stages. All those amendments we had before went like this. Again, we have been here before, folks. We can do this. And they go through this cycle. You have to get national consensus. This is not something that 51% of the people are going to do. It's not one party that's going to do this. We have to come together and win this across partisan lines. We have to win it as Americans. And that's because you need 2/3 of Congress. You need to be ratified in 38 states. It doesn't happen unless you do the hard work to win national consensus. That's number one, and I say complete. We have that consensus, and I'll show you more about that. Local networks, decentralized, local connected networks across the states, both building up the political power to demand it, even out of a corrupt system, and being ready to ratify when the amendment comes out. We're underway. 16 states have enacted constitutional amendment resolutions to overturn Citizens United. 2 of them, Montana and Colorado, did it by ballot initiative. New Jersey has done it, by the way. Good job. And Montana and Colorado ballot initiatives passed 75%, 25%. We have that national consensus. Romney, by the way, won Montana that same day by 10 points. And those same voters voted 75-25 for the 28th Amendment. So 700 cities and towns have passed resolutions, and this is building momentum all over the country. Actually, let me go back. So we're going to keep doing that, building out that network. That's going to drive those 54 votes to 67, 290 in the House. Some argue for a constitutional convention and are pushing for that. There's pros and cons to that, but we will drive towards, I put it at 65% complete, and then we have a ratification fight across 38 states. And as we're doing this and carrying this unified message of national consensus, it's not just that we win the amendment, we win all those other good reforms too, because we're really essentially disrupting the current kind of oligarchy, duopoly of moneyed parties, because we're building this new force of this new, independent, cross-partisan, dedicated to this issue, and we get all kinds of benefits along the way. July 4th, 2026, as I might have mentioned, will be 250 years since our independence, and we will declare our independence again and celebrate the 28th Amendment that overturned Citizens United and left this system to, like Tim's, oligarchic systems and theocracies and monarchies of the past, as a historical point of interest, certainly, but not something we live with. There's more on the consensus. Those are polls since Citizens United. Republican support hasn't dipped below 66%. It only dipped when we had that vote that I mentioned, because Nancy Pelosi and Barack Obama and Harry Reid were pushing the vote. The Republicans sort of scratched their head and said, wait, I agree with those guys, and it dipped to 66% and then quickly recovered, so back to where it was before. So that's okay. That's understandable. So that's some of the map that I discussed. We can talk more about any of this. What you can do, this is not somebody else is going to do it. This is you, it's me, it's all of us. It's like a barn raising. This is in Concord, where I'm from. We actually raised this barn in a day. It was incredible. It was earlier in the spring. And the point of it is, whether you think you don't have much to do, or you don't have a skill, or you don't have time, or whatever, it's not true, number one. But number two is, with all the people, we had 75 people, that whole thing went up by hand, literally. A couple of mallets, it was post and beam. And so a lot of people doing a little actually is transformative, and that's how amendments happen. And that's what's happening now with American Promise. What we do with American Promise isn't just sort of another top-down nonprofit with a good idea that wants to say, don't you like our idea too, support us. It's actually, we're bringing infrastructure, connection, networking of local citizen groups just like you. And these are pictures of just in the past couple of weeks. That's our Patriots Day parade, April 19th, in Concord. You see that banner? It says 28th Amendment, people not money. That's a cross-partisan group. This parade isn't like anyone comes in. It's the Rotary, it's the local military, it's the Minutemen, it's the clergy. It's a very sort of civic group, and they welcome our local American Promise Association to parade for this. Folks in Tampa, Florida drove 20 hours to be in Washington at Democracy Awakening. We have groups in Kansas City, Ypsilanti, Michigan, Little Rock, Arkansas, San Francisco, and more are coming all over the country. You can do it here. We'll bring you support. We'll connect you with others. We'll be at the National Citizens Summit in Washington at the end of September to, again, share ideas, build power, connection, and let us, each other, know that, yeah, we are actually doing this with Republicans, with Democrats, with independents, because we are fulfilling the mission of the country, and we're willing to put aside the things that divide us for this work. It doesn't mean that we're not going to vote and work for the candidates we want. We're not going to all agree on everything. We're still going to have a lot to argue about, but we're going to come together for this work, and we will win. That's where we are. That reminder, Americans before us did it over and over and over again. So we're challenged, folks, because if we don't, we'll be one of the few generations of Americans that had a challenge like this and didn't rise to it. I don't believe it's going to happen for all the reasons I said. I think we're going to be celebrating like they did. And I note particularly the 21st Amendment, happy days are beer again, down there at the bottom. And I'll buy beer for everybody when we win. Okay, so thank you very much. We are going to win, and I look forward to more conversation.